In this tutorial, we're going to have a look at a common rural geography exam question. Now, the question I'm showing you refers to a choice you have of writing your answer in the context of either a developed country or a developing country. That's not always going to be the case. Sometimes the question may have a focus on just one or the other, and you're not given the opportunity to choose. Other key component of this question is that you are asked to describe in detail the effects of two of the factors shown in this diagram. Now, the diagram can appear in a variety of forms, but it will always pretty much contain or likely contain some or most of these 6 features of changes in farming. It's a 6-mark question, so what you need to be able to do is choose the 2 that you wish to answer and then write at least 3 points, or that's your aim, on each of them. Although it is likely the mark scheme would credit more written on one, for example, 4 marks written on biofuels, and less written on a second, for example, maybe just 2 marks on new technology. Okay. In this tutorial, I'm going to explore quickly 4 of these, giving you about 4 points on each of the 4. So let's start with biofuels. The first effect of biofuels, and it doesn't matter whether you talk about these being grown in India, for example, if that was the country you studied as your developing country, or the United Kingdom or the United States, if that's the country that you studied in as your developed country. As long as you make sure you answer at the beginning of your answer with something like in India or in the United States. So when biofuels have been used, the first thing it does is biofuels are a crop that often generates more profit for the farmer growing it than other crops might create. And that's because biofuels are increasingly in demand, especially because of climate change related issues. And therefore, the farmer is going to make more profit from growing biofuels than they would do so from growing other crops. So that's a benefit. The second benefit, second effect in detail, is because biofuels, a lot of them when they're burned, for example, ethanol, which is a common biofuel used in countries like Brazil, they produce a byproduct which is mainly water. This means that they have a less of an environmental or negative environmental impact than fossil fuels when they're burned to power vehicles, for example. And therefore, they have a positive effect on climate change. They're not contributing as much to the creation of climate change. Now, a negative effect of the growth of biofuels has been that many farmers have removed areas of forestry, especially in countries like Brazil, in order to grow sugarcane. And the sugarcane is being converted into ethanol, which is the biofuel. Now, the negative consequence of this, or the negative effect, is the destruction of forests. You can actually link this to 2 effects. So the first thing is the destruction of forests is destroying the biodiversity of the rainforest area of the Amazon in Brazil. And that would give you a specific named example that you're referring to as well. That means there's less habitat for species to live in. Second effect you could also link to the destruction of forests to grow biofuels is that the removal of these forests then leads to rapid soil erosion in these areas. Okay. The final consequence you can say of biofuels is that many farmers around the world are converting to growing just crops that they are turning to biofuels, which is reducing the amount of food available for the human population, because instead of growing food, we're growing biofuels. And this can, certainly in developing countries like India, put a pressure on food supply. Right, so that's a lot of detail on biofuels. Let's have a look at another one of our choices, diversification. What's the effect? Well, diversification is where a farmer starts to do other activities, economic and business activities, that are not just about growing food. So what are the effects of diversification? Well, first of all, it means that they become less dependent on the profits they make from their crops. And therefore, if they have a bad harvest, it's not so impactful on the farmer because they are not just dependent on the money from selling their crops. They're getting money from other sources that they've diversified into. Second of all, in countries like India, for example, if you're doing a developing country, growing other crops can help, like fish, for example, in their rice plantations, can help supplement their diets, giving them more protein in their diet and leading them to have healthier lifestyles. Another benefit of diversification is that the farmer is utilizing one thing they have a lot of, which is land, to make money. For example, in the United Kingdom, adventure parks and off-road safari treks across their landscapes for tourists. And therefore, they're going to be making much more money potentially than they could do from using that land, for example, for sheep farming. The downside of diversification is that farmers actually might be over focusing on non-farming related activities and therefore might actually end up producing less food and producing less food to sell. And the impact of that will mean that might have an impact on the area because there's a lowering of food supply, especially if diversification is starting to make the farmer more profit than food production. Okay. Right, new technology. Now, this is one you're very likely to choose. This is a common one, and your answer can fit in both a developed and a developing country very easily. So the first impact of new technology like harvesting, mechanical harvesters like combine harvesters, is that you can harvest crops very rapidly, which allows you to grow more than one crop in a year. Okay, so it speeds up the farming process considerably. This also frees up the farmer to do a lot of other activities, like, for example, diversifying. It might free up his family, his children, for example, who can now get educated because machines are doing the work that the children might have traditionally been doing on the family farm. New technology is also meaning that less workers need to be employed by the farmer, and therefore the farmer might end up with more profit because they're having to not pay as much in the way of wages. The negative effect of that is it leads to a lot of rural unemployment, and that is true of both the developed and the developing world because people lose their jobs because the machines start to take over. A linked problem, if you want to develop that for an additional mark, is that this is resulting in increasing numbers of people migrating to the cities away from the countryside because technology is taking their job, and results in overcrowding and the formation of shanty towns in cities from people that have moved into these areas. One final issue to do with new technology on the negative side is to buy new technology. A lot of farmers get themselves into a lot of debt because they have to borrow money to buy the machines, which generally are quite expensive. And this debt can become quite difficult to make to pay off unless they make considerably additional profits. But of course, on the positive side, if they are making more profits because they're farming quicker because of the new technology, that allows them to actually improve the standard of living and the quality of their life. Right, our final one is GM crops. So if you choose to write about GM crops, what are GM crops? Well, this is genetically modified crops. Generally, the first benefit you'd want to refer to is genetically modified crops are likely to grow much quicker and much larger, leading to a bigger harvest, which makes the farmer more money. Another aspect of the positive is they're often pest-resistant crops because the seeds are designed, or the plant that grows from the seed is designed to not be so attractive to insects. And that means the farmer doesn't need to use so much in pesticides in order to stop insects eating the crops. And that has a positive impact on the environment. On a negative side, though, it's likely that most GM crops require much more intensive use of fertilizers, and these often have to be bought from companies, which involves the farmer having to invest a lot more money in fertilizers every year in order to keep the GM crops growing. Another negative is there's a lot of concern about the flavor of GM crops, as well as the potential environmental impact of growing GM crops. And this might put people off buying these crops if they're GM modified. So that it might impact on his ability to sell crops if they start growing GM crops. On a positive side, though, GM crops are far more reliable in terms of growing and can grow in drier conditions or hotter conditions or colder conditions or wetter conditions if they've been genetically modified to be adapted to lots of different environments. And this is allowing farmers to grow different food sources in different parts of the world so that they previously couldn't grow because the climate restricted their ability to grow this. But the new GM crops do allow them to now grow other things and make profits from that. Okay, so I've given you at least 4 reasons on 4 of these 6 ideas. You'll notice that some of the ideas were negative, some of them were positive. So you hopefully have created a little table that organizes them into those different categories, whether they're positive or negative. There's nothing in the question that says the effects have to be positive or negative. So if you were all positive or if you were all negative on your points, it doesn't matter because the question will not steer you in one way or other. The key, though, is that you do pick 2 of these and that you write at least 3 points on each to guarantee that you get the 6 marks. And the other key is that you must refer to a country, and the country must relate to a developed or developing. And if the question has a very specific focus and doesn't give you a choice, like for example, if it says developed, then make sure your answer is locked onto the developed country. Likewise, if it's a developing country, do the same for that.